Who's watching the watchdog? That's my question. So we've heard a lot of stories about Obamacare that's being broadcast on the news. They're all pretty much false and incorrect about people losing their health care because of Obamacare and getting worse in coverage or more expensive coverage. Sean Hannity is probably the most famous one who did this. He had on a panel of 3 different couples. They came on to talk about their problems with Obamacare, and they turned out to be incorrect. There was a reporter, Eric Stern. He decided to fact check the Sean Hannity piece. Turned out none of those people knew what the hell they were talking about, and they weren't going to get worse insurance. In fact, they were going to get better insurance. Well, guess what? Reliable sources on CNN decided to bring on that reporter, Eric Stern, to talk about his investigation of the bogus story that was on the Sean Hannity show. And let's look at some of the curious questions David Folkenflik, the guest host of Reliable Sources, had for Eric Stern.
The Democratic lawyer and writer Eric Stern joins me now from Bozeman, Montana. Eric, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Hi, David. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. You know, picking up the phone and calling people strikes me as doing actual reporting. What inspired you to do this after seeing this piece?
Because I was watching it, and it just didn't sound right. It didn't smell right what these folks were saying and how Hannity was casting it.
Now, to be clear, as is known, and you've disclosed, you're a former aide to the Democratic governor of Montana. You have an interest in this. Sean Hannity, well-known conservative, he's an opinion host. Why would you expect him to be a guy who's going to go after precision in reflecting some concerns about an act that he opposes?
I didn't expect him. It's not news that he's full of it. I just thought that at least you can't make something up out of whole cloth. You have to have at least a modicum of fact, to base even a biased story around, and this one didn't even have that.
Well, they might argue that this is true to the experiences of these people. For them, they may actually distrust the government to oversee this private health care insurance exchanges. Why isn't that simply true to their experience? Aren't they entitled to that?
They absolutely are entitled to it, but Hannity is not entitled to point to what they're saying as evidence of a train wreck and that Obamacare is currently failing. He's reporting on something that hasn't even happened yet.
Hannity is a more distinctive Republican and fixed figure than perhaps some of their other hosts, and I'm sure their news anchors, what you're going to see on Shep Smith might be somewhat different than what you're going to see on Hannity. At the same time, it seems as though what you found here is an opinion host who's presenting something as fact that you say strays far from it.
Correct. That's exactly what he was doing. A guy like Hannity is essentially the director of the right-wing information ministry in this country. Well, and that's just propaganda. It's pure propaganda.
Well, it led to a very interesting article in your part and the interesting impulse to pick up the phone and figure out what the facts actually were.
Now, what I find curious about David Folkenflik's line of questioning is that his questioning wasn't to illuminate how wrong Sean Hannity's reporting was or how bad the media has been doing on reporting Obamacare. His line of questioning pushed whether or not the debunking of Sean Hannity was correct or not. So instead of talking about how bad of a segment Sean Hannity did, we talked about whether what Sean Hannity did was right or wasn't right, which is a bullshit question, I think. I'm going to throw it to Jenny, get what she thinks about it. What do you think about that line of questioning?
Well, I think it's interesting, and I think it's really telling about the state of media today, because what you're looking at is a situation where you have news and commentary and trying to decipher the two, but it doesn't matter if you're doing commentary and you're telling lies. Right. Mm-hmm. Like, you can put your own opinion on things, you can spin things, you can pick out the pieces of the facts you want, but you can't just lie to the general public. So I think that was kind of what was missing in the discussion.
I agree with you, and it just seems like David Folkenflik thinks that maybe you shouldn't hold people's feet to the fire. Now, John, when he was, first of all, he asked her to introduce him. Now, if you were interviewing Eric Stern, would you introduce him? Now, you're a Democrat, so you obviously have an interest in this. Who doesn't have an interest in this? And don't you think, why does he have to mention that? Why can't we just talk about the facts of the case? Why do we have to pretend that there isn't such a thing as facts, which is what he's doing?
The reason that he had to do that is because he's broadcasting from CNN. And because Sean Hannity going into that segment looks so bad because of the terrible journalism that he did, you need to set up an enemy to him. So you have the bad-looking Republican, now you have the bad-looking Democrat, or at least the biased Democrat. And I loved, you were talking about his line of questioning. He had that section in the middle part of that video about, isn't this just isn't this just for them? You know, they don't like it. They're distrusting it. Isn't that just their point of view?
It's the truth to them as they perceive
It's
it.
exactly, and that's CNN's like driving philosophy. There is no objective reality. There are only dueling political sides that we're going to showcase, and then who knows who won? Who can decide? We report, nobody decides. And so the entire thing was depressing that he was treated in that way, because this is one of my favorite examples of how easy journalism can be when you actually care about journalism. Make a few phone calls. Sean Hannity wouldn't even do that. I mean, he wouldn't have liked the results if he had, but nobody on his staff cared to look into the background of those guests, and then Eric Stern did.
But I think that my really big question with that segment was, where did those people come from, right? So how did those people end up in Sean Hannity's studio? Did they present themselves to
They
Fox?
were commenters on Red State, the Red State.
I'm just really confused about where they came from. They later, when given the facts, didn't even realize their own healthcare situation. So how did they come to be on a national television show?
And how did they make it this far in life without dying so far? Like, you don't even know that you can get better health insurance than the stuff that is being canceled on you right. What else don't you know about your own situations?
I think you can ask that about anyone in America.
It's like, you
right
know,
now.
if you hear those stats where they go, 40% of the people suffer from diabetes and half the people don't know it. Well, how do you know it if they don't know it? And why don't you tell them? So, no, Malcolm. No.
It's not our job. We don't take sides on diabetes, pro-diabetes, against diabetes.
So is that really the problem with CNN here? Is that they're pretending that there isn't such a thing as objective fact? David Folkenflik, from NPR, which shows you the bankruptness of the reporting on NPR, that he thinks he's doing a good job here. This is horrendous, that he's attacking Eric Stern, the journalist, for doing the job. Instead of celebrating him, he feels he needs to push back a little bit.
Yeah.
Even though he kind of gave him kudos at the top of the thing, he has to push back on it. What's wrong with journalists?
Well, what I thought is there are a couple of things that are really telling about this piece, and one of them is when Stern says, "Well, Hannity, he's a jerk," or whatever he says about Hannity, and Folkenflik, he's a little taken aback. He's like, "Oh, because you don't say things like that, even about Sean Hannity, because Hannity is a member of our community that David Folkenflik, I think, is trying to sort of work his way up in. Eric Stern doesn't know enough. He's too much a part of the liberal, he's a Democrat who's outside of this media bubble. He doesn't know that you're not supposed to criticize Hannity that way. You're supposed to accept him as the right, and you are the left, and you can criticize him in certain ways, but you can't say that he's a joke. You can't say that he's a liar and he's an outright fraud, which is the truth."
Right.
Go right ahead.
Just something quick to add to that. I think it's like the sort of collegiate respect among journalists that's leading him to not want to see Hannity get insulted. But I think it's also incredible fear on the part of CNN that Fox could turn even more against them, attack them in some form. I mean, we're broadcasting a day after CNN. Their last week, it was the worst week for ratings they've had in 20 years. And I think that they're lower than TYT, I think. They're definitely afraid of what Fox or the more established, better performing networks might do if they're seen to be launching blows at them, I think.
But I think we're missing the point here, which is the fact that CNN is striving for something that doesn't exist. They are striving for objectivity.
Yes.
And that's what, when you go to journalism school, that's what they teach you. I think about my journalism ethics class and I laugh now because I'm like, has it really changed that much in 10 years? Or did they really just not realize this is not reality? There is no objectivity. There's always a bias on one side or the other. And when you're taught objectivity, you're told you need to represent both sides. But what if the other side doesn't have an actual viable point? What if there is fact and then there is someone's response to fact that is non-factual? That's not objectivity. That's presenting a fake reality. I think that's the situation that we've got ourselves in, where we need to move away from the idea of being objective and just move into being honest.
So when you asked your journalism professor that question, what if there is no other side of the issue?
What I was told was that objectivity is this thing that you're supposed to strive for, and it's what you work for. And no, you may not ever attain it, but you have to constantly, as a journalist, strive to be objective. Well, that's pointless.
I agree. So objectivity is good for people who don't have the facts. But once you have the facts, I think it's okay to form an opinion and then but by the way, everyone does form an opinion. That's what she's saying, is that this idea of objective reporting is a canard, which it is a canard. And I wish we could go back to the days when each city in America had 10 or 12 newspapers.
Yeah.
There was the business newspaper, there was the worker newspaper, there was the socialist newspaper, there was the, you know what I mean? There was all different points of views, and it was where you're reporting either was factual or was not factual. And it would be nice to get back to that.
And they also served as checks on each other, which
On
is what
each
this
other.
is about, which is my larger question about this segment is whether the mainstream media in our current atmosphere is capable of policing itself. Not whether they do a good job or don't do a good job, but whether they even could do a good job.
And what do you think?
Well, I mean, because what we're talking about is when you pursue objectivity as your goal, that encourages people like Sean Hannity to lie, to just make stuff up, because nobody's going to call him on it. The Republicans have figured this out.
Yes.
They know that the media is not going to say, well, Sean Hannity lied today, and here's the other side, which is the truth. So, I mean, because they can't do that. They won't allow it. And they're like, oh my God, this game is rigged in our favor, and nobody's going to call us on it.
But both sides lie.
That's true.
Let's not act like it's just the Republicans. I mean, you've got MSNBC tells lies all the time.
Absolutely, I
Both
agree.
sides are lying. And even when you talk about the facts, well, what are the facts? Where do you get the facts? Where do the facts come from? They come from a think tank who did a study, who's funded by someone. The facts are not objective either anymore. So it all depends.
I would just make 2 points. I disagree that MSNBC is the equivalent, left equivalent of Fox. And not even. I don't think it's even close. I've heard that argument before. It's as Jon Stewart says, what Fox News is doing is light years ahead of what MSNBC is doing, and it's because MSNBC is owned by a defense contractor who lets them say as much liberal shit as they can without cutting into their bottom line. Whereas it's a totally different business model at Fox News. It's all bullshit 100% of the time from the top down, right? Their vice president, Bill Sammons, admitted that he goes on his own news show and bullshits people on purpose. Stuff that he knows isn't true. I don't think you'll find Rachel Maddow. She might have a liberal view at the facts, but she doesn't introduce false facts, which that's a big difference between Fox News and MSNBC, I think. What do you say, John?
I agree with that. I would like to add one extra thing. So we've attacked sort of the sponsors, I guess, the people who finance these companies that put on the shows. We've attacked the actual people who host the shows, but I think we should attack the audience as well.
Absolutely.
Because you
There is no
pointed out, I
audience.
think correctly, that we have this idea of what journalism is supposed to be, and unfortunately, we don't have a political system that's worthy of it, or that it works in. The rules just don't apply anymore. But I also think we don't have an audience that's worthy of some sort of classical idea of what journalism is supposed to be. Hannity lied to his audience. Fox doesn't care. They're not going to chastise him over that, but I don't think his audience cares either, because they fundamentally do not go on his show to learn anything, to generate political sophistication.
Correct.
They go there to confirm their preconceived notions and to stoke the emotions they have towards politics. And he's feeding into that. So he did his job in that regard, in what journalism has become today.
And I think that's universal. I think that the real large problem is the fact that audiences aren't going out and looking at different viewpoints and different sources and actually, consuming information and making their own decisions. They're allowing other people to create and shape their worldview, which is so disturbing.
I agree.
But that's specifically to the TV audience, especially.
Oh, yeah.
Online, you have much greater diversity, and that's why I think that. But my
But you can tunnel vision online
You
too
can, you
if you
can.
only follow liberals
But you
or
almost
Republicans
can't. But you
on
can't
Twitter.
do it. You can't not do it on if you just watch
That's
TV
true.
for the most part.
I go to Smirking Chimp and I get both sides, I think, equally represented.
So that's my biggest peeve is I don't know what that site is you're talking about.
It was developed to attack Bush during his presidency, and it's still around.
Oh, okay.
RJ Eskow belongs there.
Oh,
Anyway.
okay, I got you. So they're starting a thing, factcheck.org, which is from the Tampa Bay Tribune, I think, or
Yeah.
St. Petersburg,
Something, yeah, one of those Florida papers.
And so they do factcheck.org, which I found out has been incorrect several times, just in my own checking. Factcheck.org is fucking wrong about stuff. And so they're starting a new thing called, they're starting to fact check pundits
Yeah.
and
It's
news
Pundit
shows.
Fact, right?
Pundit Fact, something
Yes,
like that.
To go along with PolitiFact.
So do you think this is a good idea, Jenny? You going to journalism school and all that stuff?
No, because they could fact check me. I don't want somebody to fact check me. No, I mean, sure, great, sounds wonderful. I don't think I would never rely on other people to tell me what is true and what is false. I want to go out and find out for myself. And I think the more people that do that, the better. And I don't know what factcheck.org's agenda is in all of this.
I'll give you an example of what I think is wrong with the media, more so than just Fox News lying or someone else saying something wrong. It's the mainstream media is the bigger problem, I think, than say Fox News, right? Because Fox News is preaching to the choir, as far as I'm concerned, and people who actually do want information outside of a political agenda will go to. They think they're getting it from CBS, NBC, ABC, NPR, and they are not getting it. They are getting corporate talking points over and over. I was listening to KCRW here in Los Angeles yesterday. Warren Olney does a show. Who I like, Warren Olney, to the point, and he was talking about the Obamacare on. So he had David Frum on. He had the guy who developed Mitt Romney's website, and he had a professor on. And they were he kept asking them, well, how do we get costs down? And none of them had an idea. They're like, we don't know. There's really no answer. Nobody even mentioned single payer. It never came up. He did a half hour on how we bring down healthcare costs with 3 people, smart people in America, experts. Not one of them mentioned single payer, and everyone knows that's the solution. So my thing is that we don't even get the right answers anymore given in our mainstream media. That the mainstream media, do you think the mainstream media has fallen down, John, right?
In terms of, well, I mean, for a long time, this is not new, I would say, but we've known for a long time that while you can identify all these different sources of bias in the media, the corporate bias, the establishment bias, the authority, the bowing down to authority bias is going to be the most pernicious, especially because while MSNBC will accuse Fox News of being conservative and vice versa, neither of them are going to point out the corporate sponsors that in many cases they share.
Yes.
And so it's perhaps the most dangerous because it's the most hidden.
And that's what I also feel. Let me ask you a question about boycotts. People think that boycotts work to help silence a voice they find offensive in the media, like when they got rid of Glenn Beck, and they tried to get rid of Rush Limbaugh. It didn't work, but they got rid of a lot of his sponsors. And now I say, oh great, you got rid of Glenn Beck. They replaced them with 5 more Glenn Becks. What you won nothing. You're not getting rid of your opposition. You're just getting rid of one guy. And so someone gets on me because on my show, the Jimmy Dore show, I have a sponsor that's also sponsors Rush Limbaugh. And I'm like, yeah, but what about all those people who sponsor Sean Hannity? And what about all those people who are Savage and Mark Levin? And so what's the difference? I mean, Ford car company, they sponsor all those shows. You're gonna stop buying Fords? You know what I'm saying?
Well, I think it's interesting that you bring up Ford because I think of it in what John was saying is that MSNBC people portray MSNBC and Fox as these bitter opponents, but in many ways they have a lot of the same interests. Their ownership has a lot of the same interests, and we think about like car companies as being opposed to each other, and Ford and GM, and these are really their competitors, but they have a lot of the same interests also. Yeah. They are interested in people driving cars more and the roads, construction, and they're interested in keeping gas prices down, and so they have a lot of common interests, much in the same way that MSNBC and Fox have a lot of common interests. And those are the things you're never going to discuss because I mean, and this is my basic point about this whole topic is that unless the mainstream media is not going to talk about the real problems with the mainstream media because the real problem is the corporate ownership of all of them, and that's not going to get discussed.
So what happened was used to have the media was the watchdog, and they would watch corporations, and they would watch Congress and politicians, and then the corporations got smart and said, why don't we just we've been buying Congress for years and we're trying to hide it, why don't we just buy the watchdog? So now they own the news media, and now there's no one watching anything or anybody, which is why we're left in the position we are in this country. John.
One final point that I want to make, and this is just, I have to play devil's advocate. Since I'm living now in this political and media climate, it does bother me the sort of bias that we see. But outside of a couple of decades of what we think of as sort of what journalism is supposed to be, what used to be in the intro animated sequence of the Newsroom, season 1, where you see Edward R. Murrow and all that. That seems like good journalism, but I think that we're fooling ourselves if we believe that prior to that, journalism journalism is always, I mean, you had party newspapers for a long period of time, decades and decades. The only newspapers you had were sponsored by political parties. You've had the desire to stir up xenophobia and stuff like that. Like, there's always been a corporate influence on media, and so we should improve what we have now, but we shouldn't believe that we can go back to some golden age of journalism, because I don't think it existed.
I agree, and I think too, in some ways, we're better off now. I know that sounds strange, but at least now there's some level of transparency as far as what your host's bias is, who's financing, the station. Okay. So, I mean, if you're not smart enough to go out there and think, Ford sponsors this network and they're not talking about this huge malfunction, then that's on you.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. We got to get out.
I also think that the TV, it's dying anyway. TV is dying anyway. The TV news. I mean, the cable news. We talk about it. We make a big deal of it, but not that many people really watch cable news compared to the larger population. And Fox News, the average, I think the average viewer of Fox News is in hospice care. So but they're not going to be around much longer.
At the beginning of that video clip, the host, David Folkenflik, said to Eric Stern, wow, you actually did some journalism. You called up and you followed up. And he said it like tongue-in-cheek, joking. But what does that say about journalism to you, Jenny, that he actually makes that joke that somebody did journalism and now I'm going to question him? Go ahead.
I mean, it's sad, but it's true.
Yes.
Honestly, though, how many big-name investigative journalists are there out there who are actually, on the ground, looking into things? We closed our bureau in a war zone for one of our major networks. Like, we don't put the money, and we don't put the money into journalism like we used to do actual digging and reporting. I don't think that, in many ways, real journalists exist, except for a very small minority.
And most of the people in America, when they see real journalism, think that those journalists should be put in prison.
Yeah. To be fair, Al Jazeera is trying a little bit in terms of the foreign reporting, sending people abroad. Like that, they're trying a little bit.
Good luck. I do like that the Folkenflik is like, so you made a phone call is what you said you did to research?
Did you use a phone book?
Yeah, now what is that?